live in Boston and on coastal cities around the world. So I wanted to give a quick introduction to our panelists, and then they will each introduce themselves. We'll talk a little bit, and then toward the end, we'll welcome questions from the audience. The audience can put questions into the chat along the way, and we will get to them at the end. So I wanted to introduce first Courtney Humphries. She is a science journalist and researcher, currently a visiting assistant professor in environmental studies at Boston College. You wave, Courtney? Hello, yes. Baylor Fox Kemper, professor of Earth, Environment, and Planetary Sciences at Brown University. He was one of the coordinating authors on the latest UN report on climate change, which is known as the IPCC report. Paul Kirschen, a professor of climate adaptation in the School for the Environment at University of Massachusetts, Boston, research director of the Stone Living Lab. And he was one of the lead authors on the second most recent UN report on climate change. So we can have, as things change over time, we can talk about that a little bit. And Philip Giffee, who's executive director of NOAA, the Neighborhood of Affordable Housing, who has a long history of activism and doing some great work in this area. So what I'd like to do is have you each maybe just talk for a couple minutes about your work, and then I'll begin the conversation, just so the audience has a little bit of context of what each of you specializes in and is working on. And Courtney, why don't you go first?
Okay, thanks, Barb. So I am, as she mentioned, I spent most of my career as a science writer and journalist in the Boston area, so writing about a lot of different areas of science, but I gradually got more and more interested in urban issues, urban environmental issues, and climate change. So a few years ago, I went back to school and I just finished a PhD in environmental sciences at UMass Boston. And so I'm interested in sea level rise, both as a writer and as a researcher. And I'm particularly interested in kind of connecting history with current planning choices for the future. We see in Boston and a lot of other cities how, our climate change isn't just about the impacts, it's about how those impacts interact with the built environment and the social systems that we have. And so I think how those things develop, the history of that has a lot to tell us about planning for the future. And I'm also interested in kind of how we govern waterfront development, how we've done it in the past and how we're doing it now, and how that kind of sets us up for adapting our shoreline in the future. And right now I'm currently teaching at Boston College, interdisciplinary environmental studies courses. I'm currently teaching about urban environmental justice. So I'm really interested in how we kind of weave justice and equity values into these decisions. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Courtney. Great. Baylor, you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks to Vernon and the crew team for inviting us to talk to everyone tonight. This is, an interesting and hopefully, interesting for me, hopefully also interesting for all the people who are listening and tuning in. The opportunity to talk about sea level rise and the impacts in Boston and thereabouts. So I'm a professor at Brown University, so not in Boston, but Providence, but very nearby. We also think about sea level rise a lot. I got my PhD at MIT in Woods Hole. And so I used to live in Boston, only at 16 feet above sea level, I think was where our apartment was. So that was a place to be. And since then, I've been working to improve climate models. So climate models are one of our best tools to figure out what's coming. And they put together all of the physics of the ocean, the physics of the atmosphere, the chemistry of the ocean, the way that carbon gets taken up, the way that we emit carbon, put all those pieces together to try and give us a better handle on what our possible futures might be. In the near term, for sea level rise, we have a pretty certain future because sea level rise has kind of an inertia to it. Once it builds up, where the sea level is still responding to the climate change that's already occurred. We've seen about 1 degree of 1 degree centigrade of global warming, and the sea level is catching up to that now. But as we go towards the end of the century, the emissions we make now will make a big difference whether we see an enormous amount of sea level rise or sort of continuing on the same trajectory we're on right now. Even though sea level rise is already a serious problem and will remain a serious problem for a long time, no matter what we do, we can certainly avoid those worst aspects. So over the past 4 years or so, I've been working with the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to produce the 6th assessment report. And so the part that I worked on is a chapter on ocean, cryosphere, and sea level change. Cryosphere is the frozen parts of the earth, so things like sea ice and glaciers, and then the oceans together with the cryosphere, the changes in those systems is what brings sea level to us. And so we tried to make the most accurate predictions we possibly can on a global scale and even on a fairly regional scale, using that information from climate models and from working together with scientists from all around the world. So that's what I've been up to.
Great. Thank you so much, Baylor. Paul, you want to go next?
Thank you. So I'm Paul Kirschen, again, a professor at UMass in Boston, and I'm also the research director of the Stone Living Lab. The Stone Living Lab is carrying out research on how the city and other parts of the world can use nature-based approaches to manage present and increased coastal flooding. But my work on climate, I'm actually by training a civil and environmental engineer, and my work on climate change really started in the late 1980s, when I started looking at how is climate change going to impact the infrastructure of the metropolitan Boston area. And in doing that work, very quickly you realize the importance of ecosystem services in managing climate change and trying to protect our infrastructure. Because our built environment depends very much upon our natural environment. A very simple example is, wetlands protect us against flooding. Streams assimilate waste. Streams, by their very nature, provide us with water supply. So there's a very strong linkage between protecting our built environment, but also the need to protect our ecosystems. And so, most recently, again, I've been working as research director on the Stone Living Lab. And the Stone Living Lab really came about because a couple of years ago, the city of Boston made the decision not to build a large harbor-wide barrier around the city, like from Winthrop to Hull, but instead take an approach that is more flexible and adaptable, essentially to elevate the shoreline with various strategies that protect it against coastal the elevation. But ideally, these elevated strategies along the coast would also be nature-based. They would mimic certain aspects of nature. So, for example, instead of using a concrete wall, which is a very hard, gray structure, they might use a berm or an elevated wetland. Something that has natural features. And on the coastal side of this, they would provide habitat. So you also support ecosystems. And then on top of these elevated areas, you can have playgrounds and parks and harbor walks, which also create huge social economic benefits to many of the communities in Boston, particularly those like East Boston, which do not have too much open space. And the other related to all this has been working with my colleagues at UMass and Boston Harbor Now and other institutions about looking at the social justice and equity aspects of climate change management. Because generally those that have had the smallest carbon footprint are going to suffer the most from climate change because they've released adaptive capacity. So in a community like East Boston, which Phil will be talking about, that population there has been oppressed and marginalized for many reasons. Just because of the physical layout of East Boston, they're going to suffer proportionality to other areas of Boston dealing with climate change. So that's what I've been doing.
Great, thank you, Paul. I already have this huge list of questions, so I'm ready to get started. All right, and Phil, can you please tell us, just give us a little quick
Sure.
info on your.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Thank you. And thank you, Vernon, for asking. I guess I'm on this panel because Vernon is retaliating against us. We asked him to come to a couple of our events in recent months, and he's been kind enough to do so. So I'll blame him for anything that I might be misspoken here. My name is Phil Giffee. I work for a community development corporation in East Boston called NOAA, Neighborhood of Affordable Housing. I'm going to assume most people are from Boston and Massachusetts, and Vernon said a couple people might be even from around farther away from that. I know Baylor is overseas at the moment, although our neighborhood, East Boston, for those who don't know, is just above his left shoulder and to the left side of his head. That's East Boston. And you may know it as Logan International Airport. So many people have lived there, flown in there over the years and probably will continue to do so. And it'll always be taken care of because if we have these events that people are describing, then Homeland Security will take it over and that's where they need to be. So they're already protected and being resilient and whatnot. I've been at NOAA for a long time. I'm the only one on the panel probably doesn't have a PhD, but my wife does. So hopefully some of that rubs off on some of the work that we're doing here. I do want to say thank you to Paul for his many years of service to NOAA and East Boston, really, because we are an EJ community. And I think that term has been effective and in use for a number of decades now. We're really grateful and it's increasing in the city with Mayor Wu now wants to focus on equity. So even more important dialogue will take place with that as a theme. And one of the fundamentals as we undertake these many measures that we'll be describing. So I'll forewarn you that Vernon put me on here to talk about how the neighborhood deals with these. So I put together a whole bunch of slides. They're too wordy. You'll say, why did he do that? But if you want the data, then I'll ship that. It's available later, I guess, through Vernon. I'll try to talk my way through it, not out of it. And then hopefully you'll find some benefit to that. But it'll describe how we at NOAA have worked with our neighborhood since climate became more of a fundamental need for us to address since Superstorm Sandy in 2012. Thank you, Barbara.
Great, thank you. So what I want to do now is give a little overview of some of the science, what we know about sea level rise now and how it's affecting Boston. If any audience members have questions, you can start putting them in the chat and we'll get to them later in the hour. So I guess Baylor, I wanted to start with you. If you could sort of give us the global picture of sea level rise. And I think, when I write about things, I'm often accused of sort of not just me, but most environmental reporters are accused of being alarmist and putting in these, high sea level rise numbers. And I don't consider myself alarmist at all. I always feel like I'm underplaying everything. So can you give us a sense of what we know about sea level rise and why it's happening and how quickly it's happening globally and maybe why there are regional differences?
Sure. So from a global perspective, there's really two ways that we can make sea level rise. One is to make the oceans bigger, that is to make them expand, and they expand if they get warmer. So global warming will expand the oceans, and then they don't fit in the ocean basins the same way. And the other way we can do it is we can take water in some form, like frozen water, that's presently stored on land, and add it to the oceans. So the glaciers on mountaintops, even snow that falls in the wintertime extracts water from the oceans and puts it on land, and then you put it back. If you change that balance and take more of that ice on land and add it to the oceans, you get sea level rise. So right now, over the past century or so, we've seen pretty even contributions from the warming of the oceans, giving about half the sea level rise we've seen, and the addition primarily from mountaintop glaciers. That's sort of the other half. As we go into the next century, we actually expect the big ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica to start melting more rapidly than they have been. That'll be a new contribution. So we expect some acceleration. So let's talk a little bit about the numbers. Maybe I can show this little slide. So this slide shows a reconstruction of sea level from the year -500. So 500 years before the Common Era up to 2020 over here on the right side. And you can see that sea level does go up and down naturally, about 10 centimeters or so. That's just a few inches. It goes up and down because of changes in all the ice and the changes between land, like I was just talking about. But recently, due to global warming, you can see that that sea level has accelerated much more quickly than it did in the past. And so the IPCC, this UN body that I worked for, concluded that the global mean sea level rose faster since 1900 than over any prior century in at least the last 3,000 years. And so things are changing quite fast. They've gone up about 20 centimeters, that's about this much, since the beginning of, since 1900. And we expect it to go at least that much, if not double that much, before the end of this century. If we really burn a lot of carbon, we could be in for much larger sea level rise, potentially multiple meters by the end of this century. And that's really serious for Boston. The picture that I've selected behind is what Boston looks like with 3 meters of sea level rise. We don't expect that to happen. It's sort of a fun thing to have behind me, but it's not. That's worse than it's going to be this century for sure. That's way outside of the range. But we're quite sure that the sea level is going to continue to rise at least through the end of this century. And so we really have no choice but to start adapting to that rise. And that's what all the mechanisms, adapting on a neighborhood level and adapting on a city level, adapting on a national level, adapting worldwide. We really have no choice but to do that, because this is what's going to come in the next decades to centuries.
Yikes, thank you. What about, can I just ask a quick follow-up? Is the Greenland and Antarctica, there's been, I know, a lot of talk about like tipping points, or will something get to a tipping point where it will sort of accelerate, in an unstoppable way, or sort of a pushing forward way. Can you talk a little bit about those? Because I know that I feel like a lot of people ask me about that a lot.
Absolutely. So people are the tipping point, the idea is you push something enough and then it sort of falls off a hill and just keeps going and takes off without further forcing. We're actually not, it's very difficult to estimate exactly where the tipping point lies. If there is one, we have some notion that Greenland has a tipping point that's nearby. But that doesn't mean that Greenland is all going to melt all at once. If it were to, that would contribute 6 meters of sea level rise. But we think that that's going to happen over the next few thousands of years. We may already have crossed that tipping point, but it's not going to come soon. It's just even if we manage to solve global warming and go back to the temperatures of the 19th century, we wouldn't expect Greenland to get back to where it was before, or certainly not very quickly.
Yeah.
But even aside from tipping points, this is something that's already irreversible on human timescales. Like even if we turn things around and we hadn't crossed any sea level tipping points, it would still take hundreds or thousands of years for the ocean to return and these big ice sheets to return to where they were before. They're big, slow systems that take a long time to recover, even if we haven't crossed the tipping point.
Interesting. Okay, well, I'm relieved that it's not. I always imagine it's like it just melts all at once. So I'm glad that's not gonna happen. But it is. I mean, it does. I don't know. It's hard to imagine timescales like that, and I think that's why it's hard to communicate things about sea level rise and climate change to people often. So Paul, I'm going to ask you to bring it down to Boston for us. And what do we know about? Because what Baylor's talking about are global averages, and what Boston is a little special. Well, we all know it's special, but Boston is very special. But why is it special as far as sea level rise, and what can we be looking at here?
Sure. First of all, again, thanks to crew for organizing this. So the sea level rise in Boston is occurring faster than most other places in the world because of a combination of local and regional factors. For example, one of the local factors is the natural subsidence or sinking of our land. Over the last 100 years, Boston's relative sea level rise has been about a foot. 6 inches of that is because of global climate change. The other 6 inches of that is because of just natural selling of the land, unrelated to climate change. And that's natural selling of the land is going to continue in the future. So not only do we have these local and regional effects, we also have this local effects of the natural sinking of the land. And so the combination of these regional local effects means that roughly by around 2050, the relative sea level rise in Boston will be a foot above present levels. And then by the end of the century, depending upon the emissions of greenhouse gases, we could have 2 to 4.5 feet of sea level rise beyond our present elevations. And I want to point out that, as Baylor's mentioned several times, if we can choose a low emission path going forward, if we can get to net zero emissions by 2050, we might only have 2 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. So if we keep on the path we're going, we may have 4.5 feet or more of relative sea level rise by the end of the century. So it's really important that we do get to net zero as soon as we can, because it's a lot easier to manage 2 feet than 4.5 feet of sea level rise. And these sea level rise impacts are going to result in two major kinds of impacts. One is increased tidal flooding. So if the sea level goes up, our high tides are going to be higher. And essentially, right now we experience maybe 10 days a year. We have what we call nuisance or sunny day flooding. It's a beautiful day outside, but there might be a slight wind, but essentially we get what we call a king tide, and parts of Boston just flood, like, Long Wharf down by the aquarium, parts of East Boston, and Morrissey Boulevard, for example. So by the end of the century, we could have 300 days a year when we have this nuisance flooding in a high emission scenario. So like every day, we're going to have, flooding of Long Wharf, flooding of Morrissey Boulevard, et cetera. The other concern about higher sea levels is, of course, our flooding from our coastal storms. And right now, we're in hurricane season. But actually, Boston gets most of their coastal flooding from winter storms, so-called nor'easters. But the point is, as an example, with sea level rise of 1 foot, which is expected by 2050, the so-called present 100-year storm could occur now on a 10-year basis. So essentially, the flooding we get right now, on the average once every 100 years, in 30 years or so, could occur once in the average every 10 years. And so many of you remember the flooding we had in January and March of 2018 that flooded, that caused, some damage around the fringe of Boston. That could occur now a lot more frequently. And then by the end of the century, the sort of expected value of flood damages to Boston it could be as much as $1 billion a year. And so it's going to have all sorts of consequences. And of course, there's going to have consequences, not only in terms of dollars, but also, people's lives, ecosystems, public health, everything, because climate cuts across all aspects of human life and life of ecosystems. These results are cause for concern. And as Baylor pointed out, if we stopped all emissions today, we're going to have climate change for centuries still. So we've got to think about adaptation and all the various forms of that.
It's interesting. I think sea level rise, there's so many other sort of consequences that people don't think about, especially in an older city like Boston. And I think about stormwater flooding and CSOs, which are combined sewer overflows, which a lot of older cities have, like Boston, where when there's too much rainwater, combined with, sometimes with flood water, then you end up releasing untreated sewage into riverways. And then I also think a lot about the subways. I mean, Boston has the oldest subway system in the world, which was not really built for this current, our coming climate. And can you just talk a little bit about that too, Paul? And then Courtney, I'll go to you for a little more history too, but can you just talk about some of these? I mean, there's so many consequences for coastal cities that people don't think about.
Coastal cities are particularly challenging because we get impacted by the so-called inland impacts as well as the impacts from the ocean. And as you pointed out, also under climate change, our extreme rainfall is going to increase, perhaps 20 to 25% by end of the century. So for example, the storm that occurs once in the average every 10 years now, which is around 4.5 inches. And that was designed, that's the amount we design our sewer systems for. By end of the century, that could be 6 inches or more. So everything that's designed today or beforehand is going to be out of design. It's going to be over capacity. And also with rising sea levels, the drainage system is not going to be able to flow so freely into the ocean as before. So it's also going to cause a backup. So we're also going to have, this cascading impact because of the rise in sea levels and our increased rainfall on our storm drainage systems. Now, in terms of our tunnels, in the 1990s, Boston was the tunnel capital of the world because we were doing the Big Dig, we were doing Deer Island, and of course, we have the 100-year-old MBTA system. Unfortunately, when they designed the Big Dig system of highway tunnels, they didn't use up-to-date sea level estimates or sea level rise estimates. So unfortunately, large portions of the Big Dig will be very vulnerable to coastal flooding going forward because they didn't consider the possible impacts of climate change when they set the elevations of the Big Dig. This can be contrast with what they did for Deer Island. So when they built Deer Island sewage treatment plant, roughly around the same time as the Big Dig, they actually elevated that higher than it had to be because they realized that there was sea level rise going on. So it just shows the importance of anytime we design infrastructure or design any building, any kind of thing, in any sort of construction in the environment, we need to design for the future, not for the present. But that brings up the challenge that we really don't know the future. Like I said, sea level rise could be 2 feet, or it could be, 4.5 feet or more. So how do you design infrastructure that can respond to this uncertainty? And that's, I have a lot to say about that, but I'll talk about that later on.
Great, thank you. I wanted to bring Courtney in to talk about a little bit of the history of Boston, which has a bit of a unique history of building out into the water that makes us perhaps especially vulnerable to sea level rise. And I'm sure other cities have done this as well. And it's just, would you just talk a little bit about Boston in particular and its development of its coastline and how that makes it especially vulnerable?
Sure. Yeah. So Boston is kind of this is something that a lot of coastal cities engaged in, was trying to kind of filling a lot of the low-lying land around the city or filling in marshy areas. But Boston is certainly unique in just kind of the extent of what it did. And so a lot of Boston, a lot of this, the parts of the city that we are used to walking on downtown and think of as completely solid land and all of that were once marshes or mud flats or just shallow areas. And so the city really engaged in this process of filling in these areas over time. It added several thousand, over 5,000 acres of land over its history. And it's an example where, we really see the history present today when we look at these flood models of how Boston might look in the future with sea level rise, where you can really see the shape of the outline almost of the original land that was in Boston within the, in the dry areas, and the areas that were filled are really going to be the areas that are most susceptible to flooding in the future. And so it's, in a way, it's bad luck, right? Because we couldn't imagine that these people couldn't, when Boston was being filled, imagine that, it would face the risks of such accelerated sea level rise. But at the same time, I think, we can learn something about how those decisions were made, and kind of what the attitudes were, what the values were that shaped those decisions to fill some of those tidal areas, which we now recognize. We recognize how valuable coastal wetlands are, but at the time they were really seen kind of as wastelands, as not very important to Boston's economic success, and so filling was really a way to create real estate, and there were a lot of debates over various projects that took place in Boston. So it wasn't necessarily something that just happened organically. There were debates. People wondered, is this the right thing to do? Is it not? And I think, as Paul said, like we need to think about how we make decisions for the future, right? And so I think that, if there's a way to, it's not always possible to know the future, right? But is there a way to make decisions that consider more possibilities and consider a more flexible, adaptive path that doesn't just lock us into creating things that we will then have to try to maintain in the future with more difficult and changing environmental conditions?
That's so interesting. And I was just working on a story that was about the hurricane barrier in New Bedford Harbor, which was designed in the 60s, right? And within probably several decades, it's going to be almost useless because it'll have to be closing at every high tide, once or twice a day. And I was just thinking, wow, that was like 50 years ago. And we have all this infrastructure in Boston that's like hundreds of years old, and thinking about, when you build something in a city, I guess you want it to last for at least 100 years, I would think, right? And how do we sort of think about that going ahead and doing it in a flexible way, I think is a really interesting question to think about. I wanted to ask one question here for the group from the chat here, and then Phil will go to you and talk about a little bit about your work in East Boston. And on this infrastructure question, somebody's asking, do you see any way to salvage current infrastructure, so like our sewer system, subway tunnels, or do we have to start everything over? So what do we do with those big dig tunnels that took forever to dig? We just fill them up and start over, or put pumps in? Like, what do we do?
Why don't I start on this? Well, there are some measures we can do to get us through, let's say, at least to near the end of this century. Like, for example, we can protect the tunnel entrances, either with building walls around it or building gates that shut when you have a major flood. So we can increase the pumping capacity of the drainage network so water gets out faster. We can put gates over the pipes that lead into the harbor from the storm drainage system to prevent backups from occurring. So there are some engineering activities we can do to protect our infrastructure. And then, of course, by elevating the coastline, whether it's with hard infrastructure or these nature-based systems, we will protect, large districts of Boston. But this will only get us this will only get us so far. I don't know when, but eventually we have to start thinking about, moving back from the coast, the idea of retreat. And this conversation about the need for retreat is, people, more and more people are realizing we need to think about that as well as one of the solutions to manage our infrastructure. But the short-term answer is yes, we can keep our infrastructure and our cities functioning for quite a while with some protection strategies like nature-based systems or flood walls or elevating buildings. We know a lot about that. But near the end of the century, if we have high sea level rise, it gets a lot more dicey.
Yeah, Paul, that's an excellent point. I think one of the things that people ask me often, are we doomed? I said, can we just give up? Let's just burn all the fossil fuels and just like forget about it. And the key difference in terms of sea level rise is we have more time. Even if big sea level rise does come, we have more time to do those steps. We get more time to enjoy the present infrastructure as it is. And also the total levels to where we're going to won't be as high, which means even if we do retreat, we won't have to retreat as far. Not as many neighborhoods will have to retreat. So we really do have a lot of control about the magnitude of what's coming. And it really comes down to that, getting off fossil fuels and getting off of them fast. It's the accumulated amount of fossil fuels that counts, not this year's emissions or next year's emissions. It's all the emissions going back to 1850. And by the end of the century, it'll be all the emissions between now and the end of the century. So if we get to net zero faster, that's fewer years that we're accumulating problems.
Courtney, was there anything you wanted to add to that, or Paul?
I would just add that, well, I think, you know, one of the things I would say is like, you know, this issue, you know, which Paul brought up of retreat and how it's, you know, it's not a very popular conversation to have. And especially in a very densely populated urban area like Boston. I mean, it usually makes more sense to think about protecting things that are already there. But I do think at some point you have to think about, you know, what your strategy is. And often in Boston, you know, the city has kind of taken a little bit of a build our way out strategy, you know, so maybe we continue to redevelop parts of the waterfront that, you know, we're kind of these post-industrial areas of the waterfront or areas that, you know, are kind of ripe for redevelopment or are of interest, you know, for real estate. And the idea is to sort of harness that and while we build some protection, some flood protection into it. And I think that it makes sense as a strategy, but if you think long-term, I mean, we are, you know, continuing to put more infrastructure, more people, more stuff, you know, along the waterfront in that way. And so just thinking about, you know, we're not just building to 2070 and then we get to stop, you know, or we're not just planning for 40 inches of sea level rise, and then we get to stop doing anything. So it's very easy to kind of have some kind of target in mind, and then try to protect that. But we need to think more about, you know, what happens next, you know. And so I think that those kind of conversations need to kind of come into play sooner rather than later, hopefully.
Great, thanks, Courtney. Okay, Phil, so you're going to bring it hyper local for us and talk about some of the work that you've been doing in East Boston. And I think you have some slides that you want to show the group.
I do. Let me, I just went right to the slide by mistake. Let me see if I can get back on and try to share. And as I do that, I'll just say that, you know, I'm from a neighborhood where I'm looking at some of my heroes on the wall here, Mary Ellen and others that I think Paul know. And let's see if I can do this. But, you know, where are we going here?
Looks good. I see it.
Okay, we got to go back up top and let it fall into place. There we go. So, you know, people retreat means sort of quitting. At least that's how we think of it now. And I think that we're not prepared to say that yet. I hear it as a word, but it's not something that, you know, is in our lexicon. And I think we in the neighborhood, or we at NOAA, and now I would say among others in East Boston, in the city, and we have a great mayor on this, is taking the lead here. We've had several very good mayors on this issue. How do people think about these things, and who speaks climate? I mean, we've got to pay bills. You've got college tuition. You've got to get a job. You've got 3 jobs. You've got a bunch of kids. You've got bills to pay. You've got, you know, how do you get to work on time? Who wants to go back to work? All these things are the things that occupy a lot of people's attention. And so when we deal with education, we're trying to help people understand at least what's the dialogue out there, so they get involved and invested in. what the future might be for them, that they are creating or helping create, and understand, what the options might be. So if retreat's on the table, they don't get edged out or elbowed out because it's an environmental justice community and they may not speak speaking English, and they may not fully understand how to deal with these issues. So I would say part of our role is to bring in great experts like Paul and others, and to be participating in this event and make it diverse and bring issues to the table. So I would say what NOAA has done over these number of years, if I can say, is, this is East Boston for people who don't know us entirely. So, Logan Airport's over here, our wonderful Belle Isle Marsh, which we want to preserve for as long as possible, is here. Suffolk Downs is an old racetrack that's being converted into a new neighborhood as well, which will sort of block Belle Isle Marsh from expanding. And then people know downtown Boston, but we're surrounded by oil tanks and right on the harbor. So there we go. I won't get into too much of this, but we've been at this a long time now. So the overtake NOAA has been 35 years old. We started doing housing issues a long time ago. We bought our first housing in the late 90s and whatnot, but we always thought, we needed to communicate better with our neighborhood about how to help them understand what the great issues were. And people said, we lost our parks. We have too many tunnels. There's too much pollution, air pollution, heat, extreme heat. I know we won't get into too much of that here, but it is causing climate change. And so people have said, we need to work on, getting more trees, which we do, that kind of thing. So we've always been invested in helping work with the neighborhood on environmental justice issues. So we have a long history of building schoolyards, building a park and whatnot. When Sandy came in 2012, we said, this changes the dialogue. This could have been us 6 hours later, give or take, however people want to describe it. And we wouldn't have been lashed. We're not going to get lashed like Situate or Cape Cod or some of the waves, toppling over, but sea level rise will come in, it'll come up, it'll go away, and then everything gets damaged, as my nephews were in New York City a few years ago. So anyway, we've been pursuing this issue for a long time. We aim to continue. We're now not the only ones who do this, but we're certainly going to continue that as part of our mission as well. So we did get a major grant from the Kresge Foundation in 2015. Paul's played a significant role again in helping us put things together. So I won't read all of these things. I'm not going to try to read them. I'll just say the strategy of how do we get the people engaged bilingually. Of course, we have a very diverse neighborhood here, a variety of languages, Spanish being the predominant one. We want to pull lots of people together, not just the people, but pull people together with experts in the city and whatnot, who will work with us and listen to us as they are around the table here, and many others through these years, to say, this is what we know, and the people ask their questions, and we try to put little reports together and give feedback to the city on what we're doing. So I won't describe our wonderful neighborhood too much, but there's no better place to be. And I guess I always say, get my PhD from East Boston over the course of my life here. Anyway, if you look at the bottom, we say something supported community planning process. I would say that's important to communicate. That's what we mean by that is, if we have meetings, we don't say, hey, y'all come. We got to say, people are busy. We're all busy. So we got childcare, you've got dinner. You may even have stipends for people to come and attend these meetings the best you can. So when you write a budget and do a program, you want to be invested and respectful of your neighborhood and your and colleagues, because this is not the highest. It may be intellectually important, but they can't always pay attention to it because, as we've been saying, these are long-term, now centuries long. Baylor hearing it, how to put the ice pack back together again. It's going to take a long time. None of us will be around that I'm aware of, unless you're Walt Disney or Ted Williams, who've got a place to go for your cryogenic therapy, whatever they do there. I'll just say again, this is the bombogenesis storm. If you can see, that's looking at Lewis Wharf near Maverick T Station. Myself and a former employee that Paul and others scooped up to work over at UMass, Gabriela Boscio, our climate manager of a few years ago. So that was really, I was down in the waterfront looking at downtown 6 hours earlier, nice, peaceful, low tide morning. And then all of a sudden it just rose, continued rising. I could show you lots of other things. This, where my cursor is the parking lot behind Shaw's in Central Square. For those who, that's the Mystic Bridge. For people who know that, this is the Charlestown facing side of the harbor. The water just comes up right into the parking lot, and that is a major flood path. And I'll show you what it looked like in a second. How does NOAA adapt to some of these things? Well, we did build Coppersmith Village X number of couple years ago. It's built to sort of what the standards are. So it's built 4 feet above the floodplain. And so if water were to come in, it would wash through the parking lot and then hopefully wash out again. So just to say things like that, we are, I think, about to put solar on the roof. We kind of had a value engineer that out for a while. But anyway, that's a combination of 71 units, 15 ownership, and 51 rental, if I'm doing my math correctly. If I'm wrong, 41 are affordable rentals and 8 are affordable homeownership units. If we have time, I'll show you a little bit about this video that we put together. I haven't done this yet with you. Okay, here we go. So this is a video. I hope it will show you. It's a something we put together a couple of years ago. Paul and I and some friends from Northern Ireland and whatnot paid for it for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We had something called Scale Up, which I'll get to in a minute. But this will sort of show you not just me talking and others talking about what could happen if there were a Sandy event that could happen in the relatively near future. I want to say 2030, who knows? It could be next year, depending on how bad the storm could be. But the arrows here are, this is Central, I'm right here, and this is Central Square. And so you're looking at an area that's right to my left, my right, about 100 yards away. I would say we got a very storm here. The tunnels are not far away. So here comes the storm. I'll let you watch it. I don't have any music to play for the next minute or so, and I can speed it up if you'd like me to. It's about 3 minutes long, but it does show you what happens. Your burgers are going to get wet, your cars are going to float away, and the water is going to do a lot of damage in a very short period of time. It doesn't need to come and stay and wash over buildings. It just needs to come in, mold up all the sheetrock and all the other buildings, and then the infrastructure gone into the tunnels, which you'll see in a minute. But this could happen because Paul and team put together a not just representation of what could happen. This will happen if we don't do protections in Central Square, because we did this according to the data that we knew to be accurate by science. I'll say that. So again, you're looking at Central Square, and I'll just let this play for a minute. I'll try not to blab on too much. We have a longer version if you want that with a little bit of music. I can speed it up a little bit. Okay, so here's Central Square, and it's about to go in down. This is Maverick Street, looking towards Maverick Square. The tunnels are downhill from me, and so the water that's going to get there. So all the tunnels that we're now fixing in the summer tunnels, you say you can't go in there in the weekends. Well, what is this water going to do to all that infrastructure that we're building? So just take this as an example of the kind of thing that if we don't do the protections that we're talking about here, these are the kind of things that will happen to us, and you can only imagine. So I don't know how New York fixed that or what it cost. They probably got, what, $50 billion to fix that. But the feds aren't going to give $50 billion to every city because they're just not. And insurance is never going to cover anything, really. You get 20%, you're lucky and have to fight for the rest of your life, but the rest goes to the lawyers. No offense, anybody. So this is sort of what it looks like over time, and nobody wants that. So we do these, or we did this to try to help people understand, what could happen in our own neighborhood, not to scare people. We're trying not to do that, but to say, this is what's going on in our neighborhood. I'll try to speed up a little bit, although I may be talking too fast. In any case, we did hold our neighborhood's first climate summit just about 5 years ago, if my math is right. And so we did have our mayor, then Mayor Walsh, attend with our city and state council representatives and about 300 other people. It was a very diverse audience. Senator Markey heard about it and he said, I'd like to come. You're welcome. So he did come, and we're grateful that he did. We try to make an emphasis on how we communicate. So I don't speak a word of Spanish. I struggle enough with English. Oscar Chacon of Alianza Americas did speak in Spanish to the group. We had probably, I think, 75 people, Paul, give or take. And we had some other Spanish speaking only workshops for people. Those who wanted to go to other workshops and could speak enough English did go, but we want to respect the fact that there are a very diverse audience and try to include them in the conversations that take place here. Again, former mayor, now Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh, of whom we're very proud, former staff, and again, Senator Markey. I love this photo. And if you met a couple of these women, you'd love them. We have a great youth program, and Gabriela Ramirez, who you might know in the Boston area and now works for the trustees of reservations. She's fantastic. She could have my job. in the near term. And we do a lot of youth development with our youth program. You'll see her in the future. So just remember the name of Gabriela Ramirez, not the corn, but it's a good photo.
Phil, I just want to make sure that we have time for some questions
Okay.
and discussion at the end. So is there like a final point you want to?
Final, well, okay, youth summits. We've held a couple of youth summits. We do a lot of outreach again. Sorry, Barbara, I could go on and on. Thank you for stopping me. So I would say is we do a lot of education with people, with the city and others. You know, I want to talk about budgeting and capital planning over time. It's eventually got to get down to that. You want to be involved in it. You don't want to leave it to any one particular group. Again, with Paul and whatnot, this is East Boston right here, Logan Airport. These are the islands that we could become again. A lot of workshop themes here to go on. So again, we're trying to help educate people for all sorts of things on, you know, how do you become aware of things? How do you respect people? What kind of infrastructure do you need? How do you do emergency preparedness, which we haven't even gotten into yet, but we hope to hold a workshop on that in the future. So the Robert Wood Johnson work we did was very considerate of people, tried to do a lot of outreach and investigation of the neighborhood, what they knew about it. It told us who knew what, where, talked about social cohesion, a term you're probably more familiar with than I, but how to pull people together so we don't have camps of people. We have interests working together. We're holding a resiliency summit. Well, that was a resiliency. We did hold a summit again 2 years ago, which is where we first previewed the flood model, which I just showed you. How we deal with these things, what the neighborhood could look like again. So our office is like right back in here. But if you were to deal with the DPA or Central Square, if you could build things, and I think I heard somebody say earlier, maybe it was Courtney up top, about there needs to be some waterfront rules and regulations that somebody needs to be in charge. There's 16 to 18, 20 different groups. We won't get anywhere unless those people are talking with each other. I don't want to hear 5 years from now, I did my job, and then the floods come and nobody did anything. They have to work closely together. Very important for us to have access to the water, parks, and affordable housing. Please emphasize affordable housing, whoever else is on the agenda here. We can't do waterfront development without paying attention to those who live here, build culture, work here, have been invested here for many, many years. I won't say more about heat other than to say, there's the waterfront again. We need more trees. Heat is coming. Nobody's going to get away from that one at all. These are some solutions that we had about how to deal with all that kind of thing. So I won't go into all that. I'll just say lastly, Barbara, we're holding a summit on 2 days about a resiliency summit to get people motivated, involved in how do you talk about, you know, resiliency and preparedness and those kind of things. So we're not just talking about, you know, climate or heat in that respect. We're talking about what really affects you in order to build a network of interest. And we don't all agree for sure in East Boston, but we do have the interest of the neighborhood. So our role, we find, is try to get people talking with each other, take some of the politics out of it if that's possible. It's going to have to happen anyway. So we've got to be able to talk with each other as we sit down here. And then the next phase is, as the Robert Wood Johnson money said, have an emergency preparedness summit so we knew what to do, where to go if there were a disaster or an event of some kind. I have a whole bunch of questions here. I won't go into them now. You can look at them. They're not the questions, they're just some questions. So I'll stop sharing and turn it back to Barbara.
Great. Thank you, Phil. And anybody who wanted to get a copy of those slides could reach out to you and get them if they want to go into some of the detail. Thank you for sharing. That's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. So we have about 5 minutes left. I wanted to ask one audience question here and then one other question to you guys. And the audience question is there any lessons for Boston from the New Jersey, New York coastal storm preparation plan that was just released? And this is something I'm actually not familiar with this plan, but this is something that I think is on people's mind a lot as hurricane season is approaching. And do you, any of you who have seen the plan or are familiar with what some other cities are doing, can you comment on that? Paul, you're probably the most likely, or Courtney.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've not seen the most recent New York City plan, so I really can't comment on it.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't comment on it from an engineering standpoint. I know that they're looking at kind of like having a bunch of sea gates, I think, versus you know, a major storm barrier for that area. And I can't comment on the specific plan. I would just say that in general, I mean, you know, one of the issues which Phil actually raised, was just like that we, how do you govern whatever choice? We talk a lot about what we should do, right? Should we build things on the shoreline? Should they be natural? Should they be hard? Should we have a big barrier? Should we have sea gates? Those kinds of questions. But one, another question is sort of how would that be governed? Who would be in charge? How would it be paid for? How would it be maintained over time? And so I think, one of the things that, there are sometimes, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers comes in with a big plan and they have this authority to do it, right? The kinds of things that Boston is talking about in East Boston and other neighborhoods is a much more, little bit by bit, look neighborhood by neighborhood, improve the shoreline in areas. And so it's it has its own challenges because, at first, even though these are individual projects, as if you're thinking about sea levels rising over time, what you're really doing is creating an infrastructural system, right? That's going to protect the city from flooding. And so unless you have some kind of authority or some kind of, governance over this whole system, it's going to be challenging to kind of make sure that it's actually doing everything that it needs to do across the city and that everybody's protected and things and questions like that. And so I guess I don't have a specific comment on that plan, just to say that all of these kinds of solutions raise the issue of kind of governance, and some of them are easier for an authority to come in, like the U.S. Army Corps, and do something big. Sometimes you can do a lot of small things, but then you have to think about how it's all going to stitch together. And so that's kind of one of the challenges Boston has.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we are out of time. I'll take moderator's privilege and have you each sort of leave us with one final thought. And what I want to ask you is the Biden administration has just passed a bunch of legislation that's handing out money for all sorts of climate projects. And if you had your way, I was wondering what would you take a chunk of money and spend it on? And I'm interested, I'm going to start with you, Courtney, and put you on the spot, because most people want to build things and buy things. And so if you had your way, how would you achieve some of what you're talking about with that money? What would you do? And then I'm going to give each of you get 1 minute to say how you want to spend. I'll give you, how much should I give you in IRA money? I'll give you $1 million. What's the best way to spend it to help solve this issue? Courtney, you're on the spot first.
Oh boy. I guess I would focus on, I don't know, I would just focus on bringing people together. $1 million isn't a lot of money, right? So give me billions. No, just kidding. I guess with $1 million, I think, we have a lot of these conversations, but I think, we need to get, state agencies together with cities, and there has to be more focus on getting decision makers together and really kind of deciding some of the stuff, as I said, around the governance of how to do this. Whether we need to change some of our regulations to allow for some of the kinds of things we want to build on the shoreline, how we're going to actually implement maybe processes that consider equity and justice and things like that. So I'm taking kind of a people-focused solution, but it's really to try to get decision makers, get their time, get them to come together and have them actually make some decisions about how to do some of this stuff.
Okay, you got to bribe them with some awesome snacks or something, or like a cool party, and then they'll show up. All right, Phil, $1 million. What are you going to spend it on? You've got all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to follow on Courtney's theme, I think that, and we've been saying there needs to be a waterfront czar. That sounds like it's an opposition to community process, but it isn't. I think the city is under, this foundation of equity and fairness and whatnot. So everybody will be included, but the czar needs to pull the agencies together. I think I'd split that if I had to. Barbie, give me another $1 million. I say the state gets $1 million, and they have to hire a czar to control the waterfront, and that meant that somebody has to control the Army Corps too, because they can't come in and say the bridge goes up, we decide, little boat goes through, and everybody else gets, whatever. And I think that we need to get people together to make that kind of. I would also pull in the insurance companies, and I'd also pull in the private sector. You're not going to get out of this without pulling in the private sector. They own a lot of land. Doesn't matter what we say, you got to get people on property rights. So you need the czar to pull the insurance companies and the private sector, whoever that is, the Brian Coops of the world, to the table so that we start deciding these kind of things together, not in our little corners or in some little corners of power that then sort of leave the rest of us out.
Interesting. Okay, so far we got, maybe you two could pool your money and we got a big party with the czar and all kinds of people there. I'm liking this. All right, Paul, what are you gonna do? Are you in this party? You're gonna go build a nice big wall?
Well, I think Phil and Courtney's ideas are really important. So I just throw this idea up as well. You know, if you look at the city in their vision for coastal flood protection, they have this green coastline of nature-based systems along the coast. Well, there's a lot of gaps in our understanding of how to design these, how these are going to perform over time. And so we really need to start filling those gaps. So I would invest $1 million in some research on the performance of nature-based systems. And also, I look at the biophysical performance, but also their social economic performance. Like, how can we build these natural systems without, which makes a neighborhood greener, but also invites gentrification? You know, how can you manage that? And so that's what I put $1 million into.
All right, that's a good. I like that. And maybe Phil and Courtney will invite you to their party as a.
I hope so.
Yeah.
It's a good party.
All right, Baylor.
So I guess when I look forward to this winter where we're all going to have really expensive power because of the war in Ukraine and all of that, I'd really like to see us shifting faster onto renewable resources, which we don't have to spend petrodollars to keep dictators in power. I would really rather that we were producing that energy nearby. And I'd really like us to see some conversions in New England where we have oil boilers and furnaces and natural gas boilers and furnaces, particularly in the lower income neighborhoods. We really should get everybody on heat pumps so that we can use renewable solar and wind driven power to heat our homes. That would be a great switch.
Fantastic. Wonderful. All right, good. All right. This makes me feel hopeful. So thank you. I'm glad you guys are on the case and thinking about it. So thank you very much, Courtney Humphries, science journalist and visiting professor at BC, Baylor Fox Kemper, professor of Earth, Environmental Planetary Sciences at Brown, Paul Kirschen, professor of climate adaptation in the School for Environment at UMass Boston, and Phil Giffee, executive director of NOAA. Thank you all very much for joining us. And Vernon, thank you very much for hosting this event. And thank you all of you who came to watch today.
Take care.
And thank you, Barbara.